Three, two, one, and welcome back to the SBH podcast. So in this podcast, we're actually going to be going off of what we did last podcast, which was me talking about spring and what's going on in spring. In this podcast, I'm going to be pretty much getting my plugs set up for spring fishing, and that is pinching barbs, replacing hooks. And I'm just gonna be grabbing plugs, and these are actually not plugs from Pumbaa Plugs. A lot of these are plugs from other companies, but the reason I'm gonna be using these plugs right now is because I haven't touched these since I started fishing with Pumbaa Plugs, because I think that the Pumbaa Plugs are better than most other plastic brands, as well as they're environmentally friendly, which these plastic brands are not. But it doesn't mean I'm not going to be using certain plugs for certain applications. So I'm actually going to I'm wheeling back now, grabbing my plugs, my Pumbaa plugs. And I guess we can start with these plugs first. So right now, I have a bunch, and when I mean a bunch, I mean a bunch of Pumbaa plugs, but I need to get a few of them that I'm going to be using in the spring set up for spring fishing. So a lot of the plugs that I fish in the spring are pencils and walking plugs like this. So the thing is, I probably will switch back to treble hooks later in the year. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be pinching barbs on plugs that have trebles, and I'm also going to be switching out hooks for inline single hooks. Okay, so what I got is two different sizes of inline singles. And so really at this point, what I like to do is I like to switch these plugs over and to having inline singles, and then I have to use them to see if they work the same. So that's the thing. I haven't tried these with these inline singles, so this will be an ongoing process. For right now, though, I am going to switch to an inline single hook on this Magnum Walker right here. So I'm going to grab my tool. If for any of you that haven't done this before, this is how you switch out hooks on plugs, and I have a ton of plugs. And I have a bag of other plugs, but we're going to start with the Pumbaa plugs first. So I've had a lot of luck with the Magnum Walkers this season. I've had a lot of unfortunate things happen with the Magnum Walkers. One of those is I've had so many 40-plus inch bass come up and hit the plug, but I've been unlucky and not been able to actually hook them. I've had a few 35s in the fall. I had one day where I got 6 bass over 35 inches in back-to-back casts on this plug, so that was a lot of fun. So right now I'm just going to be switching out these split rings and treble hooks for inline single. I'm just going with VMC for now. I'm sure there are other companies that are better. The only reason I'm using VMC is because they're the cheapest. And the thing about doing this is I want to have a handful of plugs that are ready for spring, but I also don't want to break the bank while doing it. So these were, I believe, $5 at my tackle store. So I will be switching a few plugs over. The only reason I didn't buy a lot of them is because I don't know how the plugs are going to react with these inline singles. All I know is that this is the single hooks that I'm going to be using. I do know, however, that this is pretty heavy, a little bit heavier than I think this treble is. And it is. So that means the weight is going to be slightly different. However, it shouldn't be too bad. So what I'm going to do is just get this other treble hook off. I'm doing this at the end of table that the mic is on, so we might have a little bit of tapping and clicking when I'm setting things down. But I'm just gonna take off the hooks on these. This plug has never been used before, so it's a little bit, so the hooks and trebles, or the hooks and split rings are nice and fresh and sharp. So I'm like stabbing myself. I'm sure my hands are gonna be all cut up by the end of this, but I have a lot of plugs to go through. So I'm gonna try to go through a lot of plugs, but I'll also try to tell some stories that are involving these plugs as well. Because this wouldn't be very interesting if I was just straight taking hooks and split rings off for the entire video, which I'm gonna be doing, but I'll hopefully tell some interesting stories along the way. So yeah, I was fishing with the Magnum Walker a lot, and it quickly became one of my favorite topwaters that he creates. The thing is, big walking, like spook style plugs for striped bass are absolutely killer, because the thing is, they have that slower lackadaisical motion on the surface, which makes it very difficult for a bass to pass up going after it and hitting the plug. So it's taken a lot of really big fish. Recently, there's been a big movement on the dock plugs. This is a lot like the dock, except for the fact it's a little bit heavier, so it has a little bit better casting, and it has a little bit different nose. So the nose in this, as I've talked about in the past, is actually cut at an angle, which makes it sit on the surface, and you can walk it right on the surface. I've used a lot of other wooden spook style plugs because I've been trying to find heavier ones, because the casting distance on the docks are not very good, as many of you know. And so when I'm throwing this on the surface of the water, it doesn't dive like a lot of other wooden plugs do. A lot of other wooden plugs, working it, you see a big fish and you get excited and you start ripping a little bit faster, you get a rhythm. As soon as you do that, the plug dives under the water. And that will immediately, not necessarily all of the time, but a lot of the time, that it diving under the water is going to deter the fish from actually hitting it. That's like big on number one. That's really big of, like, for this plug to not dive under the water has given me second chances at a lot of big fish. And the other thing about this plug that is really great is it has a good profile. Now, the profile of this plug is of most bait fish. So if you think of like a bait fish that the bass go after, whether that be Atlantic menhaden or pogies, whatever you want to call them, or mackerel, name any other bait fish that like larger bait fish that the bass go after, that's pretty much the size. So when the bass are going after the plug, that's the size that they will be. Like, this is about the size of like a large pogie or a large mackerel. So this is the age-old question, I guess. Do you have the hook riding down, or do you have the hook riding up for the tail? I think down. And people are probably going to be like, you always have to put it this way, but not necessarily. But I think it riding down is definitely the way. I mean, obviously that's what you want it on the belly, but sometimes people like putting it up on the tail. So keeping that in mind, I'm just going to be switching this here. Yeah, I'm very curious. I am going to work these after this podcast. I'll go down to the harbor and throw these and see how they go in the water. Am I doing this? Of course, I just put it on the wrong way. Ooh. Yeah, so we want it like this. Okay. So that's a very, so I'll be very curious to see how this affects the action of the plug. If it affects it negatively, then I will have to switch up the size of the treble, or of the single hook, to either a larger or smaller hook. So the other thing about using single hooks on these plugs is the hookups are not going to be as good. So when you're working this plug, it's not going to have as good of a hookup ratio, but it is however going to have a better secure, like a more secure hookup. So if the bass does get hooked, the hook is going to be penetrating much better, and it'll be harder for the bass to bend it out. So yeah, but the thing is, it's going to probably limit a lot of the smaller fish eating this because it's going to be a bigger hook. But at the same time, if you get a really big fish, hopefully it hits it more than once, because it's going to have a little bit harder time hooking up. But what I'm trying to do, I'm not entirely sure if I'm actually going to pinch the barbs. I guess I will. I mean, in for a penny and for a pound, I guess, right? If I'm going singles, I might as well just go barbless as well. So pretty much what I'm trying to do is make it easy on those spring bass when they're first showing up, going single hooks and also going barbless, because a lot of the bass are smaller, and I am going to be switching this out for a treble later in the season, and I'll probably stick it, I mean, depending on how I like barbless more and more, but also I don't want to lose a fish at my foot. So if you can imagine hooking into a really large fish and you get it all the way, you keep tension on the line, you get it all the way to your feet, and you're, pretty high up on a rock or something, and the bass is thrashing right at your feet, and you have barbless hooks, and what happens is the bass is going to be able to shake in a way that will probably create some slack if it's at your feet, and then it will probably spit the hook if it is barbless. So that's what makes barbless not as good as having barbs, obviously. But it's better on the fish, and it's better on you if you get hooked yourself. So that's what I'm going to be. So I guess that's, good. And I'll probably do the same thing in the fall when I have some time. I'll be switching them back to single hooks and stuff, because in the fall there's a lot of big fish around, but there's also a ton of small fish around. And the thing is, I don't really necessarily need to be fishing with treble hooks in the fall, because 90% of the bass that I'm catching are going to be in that low 20-inch size. So yeah, they're going to be that low 20-inch size, which will make it, it will make it so I don't necessarily need to be using barbless hooks or barbed hooks, because it will rough up the bass a good amount. So look at this. So in theory, you can see this, right? Are we good? Yeah. Oh, the light here shows it off good. There you go. Here's your Magnum Walker with, there's your Magnum Walker with the two singles. Now I have to test this out to see if the sized 7 VMC inline circles are the way to go for the plug. So I have to do some more testing, but right now this is what I have on there. This is my best guess as to what will probably be good on this plug, but again, I'm not entirely sure. I might have to go size down. I think this could be a little bit heavy, but this is plug number 1. So I want to do it on a plug like this as well. So that's a good spring plug that I'm going to be throwing. I have another Magnum Walker right over here that's in mackerel, and I'm going to have these two with singles. This one, the trebles are a little bit more dirty, but that's okay. More use, I guess, been in the salt. So that's pretty much what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to do 2 of the plugs in with the singles. Oh, I should probably also, before I do this, hold on. Before I do this, I'm going to actually pinch the barbs on this hook here, on the hooks here. So the way this works is pretty much got to take some pliers, some small pliers here, or you can take a file. And I don't know, this is a beefy barb here too, which is, I guess, the reason why I'm doing this. But what you want to do is you want to slowly start pinching the barb on this, which can be slightly difficult sometimes. And you want to try to find the best way to do this. This is a tough barb. I might have to see. It's interesting depending on certain plugs or certain hooks. I mean, have different different hardnesses to the barb. This is a very tough barb to crush. And I'm putting a lot of pressure on it too, and it's just not bending, which is pretty extraordinary. Slowly getting it there. But the goal of this is to hopefully lessen the barb at least a little bit, making it not quite as bad for the fish when it gets hooked. I think I got it here. Okay, good. Okay, so I've pinched the barb a little bit on this. And I will do the same over here. And then we will continue. Yeah, okay, I've got the technique down now. Yeah, okay, we're good. All right, so those barbs have been pinched. So now let's do this next plug. So I'm just testing out these two to start. And I like to have two plugs. Generally, I like to have like a white or a yellow, and then like a realistic colored plug in my bag. So whether that be bunker or mackerel, which are pretty much the two main forages for the larger striped bass in my area. So that's the two main like larger white bait fish patterns that I have are a bunker or a mackerel. And then of course the yellow or white is the two colors. And these are for daytime topwater plugs. And in the spring I will mess around with throwing plugs that are in that have the like shad color to them, or like alewife color. So that's the like bluish purple, like this plug on the end here has a bluish purple tinge to it, I guess. So that's like the one that I'm going to be throwing in rivers and stuff when the alewife spawn. They swim up the rivers and are really, that's where the first few large bass start staging up and feeding on those bait fish. So that's like the first ones that I will be targeting, are the first colors that I'll really be using in the spring when I'm targeting larger fish. So when I'm targeting like those schoolies, the schoolie bass, I'm using small pencils, small Magnum walkers, and all the stuff like that. But when I'm going up in size and I'm starting to attack bigger fish, I try to get a little bit more particular with what bait they're going to be feeding on in the spring and what I need to be matching, or like matching the hatch with. I'll be getting to other plugs that I do use in the spring. And the thing is, I'm not using exclusively Pumbaa plugs, but if I'm targeting large fish, I am going to be using them when I'm targeting a lot of my larger bass. There are a few other plugs that I use for schoolie size striped bass. I love bucktails and like little swim shads are also great in the spring. So I use stuff like that. I do use small SP minnows in the spring. That's another plug that I do have to give some credit to because it's a plug that I do use a lot. But the Pumbaa plugs has come out with a wobbler, which has a very similar action to it. It's just a little bit larger. And so if I'm targeting larger bass and I would be using a SP minnow, I'll actually be throwing a wobbler in those scenarios because the wobblers have the exact same action, but they have a little bit different profile, and they tend to get a bigger fish's attention. Even the bigger SP minnows, I prefer the wobblers, which I have one right here. This is a wobbler. So a wobbler has a little cupped nose, and it has a very similar wobbling action. I'd say it's kind of like a mag darter, but it also has that little wobbling action, and its tail will shake a little bit as it's swimming too. So it has that same action as like an SP Minnow, but as you can tell, I mean, it's a little bit bigger. I mean, do I have an SP Minnow here? Oh, so this is I do. I have a lot of plugs here that I will be showing. Okay. This is a large SP Minnow. And this is a wobbler. The wobbler is a little bit bigger. Just a little bit. I guess go this way. Yeah. So there you go. That now you can kind of get a sense of how big the wobbler is. Okay, we'll put this guy back. I am not going to be switching out stuff on this because this is a plug that, yes, I'll throw on the spring, but I won't be throwing that often in the spring. So, and most of the bass most of the time I fish during the day in the spring or in the evening. I think during the spring, I think it's pretty similar fishing at night to during the day. I think it's one of the rare times through the year, even including the fall. I think it is one of the rare times in the year that fishing during the day is equal to as fishing at night. As far as you should be able to, those bigger fish are still feeding. So there's not going to be a lot of like huge fish around, but in the spring you do have those times where you'll have your 35 to 40 inch bass around, and I think they feed equal during the day as they do at night in the spring. And if you hunt in the rivers and the estuaries at certain times of the year, you can really have a fun time on top with smaller, like the small Magnum Walker, which I'm going to be switching out. I actually have to do some testing first on it, but I will be switching it out after this video. I will be switching out the hooks on that. The small Magnum Walker have very good, is a good profile size for the rivers and stuff this time of year. And it might be, you might think, oh, it's a little early to be starting to get your plugs all situated. And the thing is, when you have as many plugs as you have to go through as I do, it's not really early enough, I guess. I have a lot of plugs that I need to sort through before the season starts. And the thing is, as I've said in another podcast, like once the season starts, I don't really organize my stuff. I have what I'm going to be using, and then I just throw it in my bag, and then I'll use that until I either break it or lose it, which happens a lot. I mean, you have a lot of the times you'll have a bass, and the bass will snap you off, or you'll break a plug in half, which is never fun. I've had that happen to me 3 times. I've had bass snap my plug in half. And I had it happen on a Tsunami talking popper. I was fishing a Tsunami talking popper, and I hook a big fish, and I hooks it, wham, and the plug just snaps right in half. I think I have it actually in a box over there. I'll grab the box and see if I have the half of the plug in there. But yeah, it snapped it clear in half, which is really extraordinary because it was a brand new one, and it just snapped it right in half. And I've only had that happen a few times, but it does happen. Sometimes it's hard to get these. Oh damn! Sometimes it's hard to get these split rings onto these inline single hooks because they're a little bit thicker around the eye, so it's a little bit more difficult to get a split ring around it. And I'm using split rings off of the Puma plugs that have a lot of rings to them, so you can switch them back and forth on a plug. Probably going to be getting cancer here because I'm breathing in the dust that's coming off of the rust from these So I was trying to blow the dust away from my face. But these plugs are gonna be doing very well in the rivers, because what happens is these bass sit in these eddies in the rivers, and they are sitting there on the bottom. They're looking up, and they'll see this Magnum Walker come dancing across the surface right at it, and they'll come up and they'll smash it right on the surface. And it's interesting. It's pretty much where the first larger fish go. That, and in the boulder fields, I got some bass in early June that were in the mid to high 40 inch size in early June. So, and a few of them even on top. So that's also extra cool. I'd say pretty much in early June is when the big fish start pushing in. Here I should start seeing my first 40 incher in early June, but you can never know. It really depends on the bait. If the bait does what it did last year, I just put this on wrong. Bummer. When the bait comes, if the bait does what it did last year, which is we had a lot of Atlantic menhaden, and they stayed in close to shore for a lot of the season, which made some incredible blitzes, as well as some incredible night fishing off the rocks. So that's a big tip. If the bait's doing what it did last year, I would highly suggest fishing off the rocks in the early evening, because what happens is a lot of the really large bass are going to be pushing in, and it's going to make it extraordinary fishing. And that's what it does. What happens is the bass are following these huge bunker schools, and they out deep in the water. I'm trying to figure out how I can put this on here. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time this plug, but okay. So what will happen is I'm trying to just focus like hard on putting this hook on. Okay. Deep breath. I'm sure I'm not the only one that gets angered at these hooks not doing what I'm supposed to have them do, which is get on these little eye that keeps of this plug. Okay, here we go. We're good now. Okay, so I keep losing my train of thought here. But what happens is these bunkers during the day are out in the deep water, and then at night they get pushed in close to shore. And especially in the spring, the bunker will get pushed in close to shore in the early morning. And you can, on the beaches as well, like sandy beaches, you'll be seeing these epic blitzes. And these are definitely not small fish that are blitzing. I'm talking about 30-pound bass blitzing on these bunker in pretty shallow water too, in some scenarios. And even in the estuary and river mouths, there was a few times last year where it got pretty extraordinary. Okay, here we go. Plug number 2. See, this is not a quick process, as you guys are probably starting to find out. It's not a quick process to be switching up treble or single hooks on these plugs. And what I try to do is 2 of every plug. So really right now I have these larger hooks on this plug. Now, the cool thing about this, if you think about it, if this is the bass's mouth, the bass's mouth is opening this way and closing like that. Okay, get it? So this is just the rim of its mouth. With a treble, what happens is it will eat the plug, and then you have 2 hooks that are in the fish, and it will only penetrate just to where the barb is right here, like just to the underneath the barb. Although you have 2 points of contact, it makes it a little bit easier for them to get more leverage on the hook to bend it. Now, the other thing is it doesn't have as much, it's not really as secure. It's kind of just like sitting halfway into the fish, it's not that secure. If the bass shakes the right way, it can pop the trebles out pretty easily. So, but if you have this bigger plug here with these single hooks and it goes around the fish's mouth, now when the thing is going to go into the bass's mouth and out the top, and so now there's no way, no matter how hard this fish shakes, that it's going to be able to fully get the hook to fully rotate around its mouth and pop it out. That's very, very difficult for the bass to do. So it might be more difficult when the bass is coming up and just slamming into the plug for it to hopefully get hooked. It's gonna really have to like close around the plug for us to have a hope of this going into it. But once it goes into it, it's gonna get hooked. And really, it's an odds game. The more hits you get from the bass, the more likely it is to end up getting hooked. So I have those two done right there. Now I'm going to move into slightly smaller hooks. So now I'm trying something out a little bit differently. So these are size 2 VMCs, and I'm going to put them on this. This might be a little light. So now here we go. This is me trying out different things here. I've also smaller plugs that I'm going to put this on that are coming out later. So I'm not going to show you guys now. But I really got this for a specific pencil that is coming out over the Rhode Island Fishing Show. So I'll start posting about it after the Rhode Island Fishing Show. I had incredible luck on it in the spring and caught so many schoolie bass on the plug. It was extraordinary. Like probably the best pencil popper I've ever seen. It's your first hint, but yeah, I mean, it was an extraordinary plug. I caught so many large, like between 30 and almost 40 inches on that plug, and it's not a very big plug. I mean, there's different sizes, but the one that I was fishing, it was small. It was smaller than this big eye, and I was catching a lot of really big fish on it, and it absolutely casts like a missile too. And the blitzing that I was having going on was truly extraordinary as well. The blitzing was fantastic blitz fishing, and the plug just held up perfectly to these bass, and they were like full wolf pack. Like you'd have like 40 schoolie sized bass, and you'd throw the plug in there, and it was like a gong show. I mean, the things were like, absolutely leaping out of the water, knocking the plug 4 feet out of the water. It was truly extraordinary to watch them just go off at this plug. I mean, it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to watch. And the more I've fished with pencils in topwater, the more I've loved them. So I truly, like, during the day, I rarely fish anything else but pencils. Rarely. And the reason that I rarely fish anything else but pencils and, I guess topwater, pencils and like walking spook style plugs, is that I think this is definitely going to be small. But yeah, see, the problem with this is these are going to be too small for this plug. For sure. Too small for this plug. So I'm going to put these back, but I am going to put them on a different plug, and I'm going to put these hooks back on. Okay, so that was just me testing and messing around. So a lot of what I do, and I want it to be raw for this podcast. I didn't want like me to have all of this pre-planned. I want this to be raw. I mean, this is what I do. I take these plugs and I look at them, and I mess around with the split rings, and I then after doing this go out and fish with them, just throwing them, not really fishing, I guess, just casting them and working them back, seeing if the action is still good on them. And if it is, then I'll be super stoked if the plugs that I was just messing around with, especially the Magnum Walkers, are good, because I could keep those Magnum Walkers with singles all season if I end up catching a lot bigger fish, or like if I can still catch big fish on them and I'm not losing as many, I'm not losing as many shots, because I obviously am going to be losing shots at hooking into these fish. But if I'm hooking these fish and they're staying pinned perfectly, that would be a big confidence booster, because I've had a lot of bad luck hooking into large fish and then having them shake the hooks, especially with Magnum walkers. So it'll be good to have that going for me. I will pinch the barbs on this plug, however, so we can do that for this treble hook. So I'm kind of doing a bit of both. I said that I would do a bit of both, having some singles and having some trebles going. So that's what I'm going to probably do, is have a few barbless singles and a few barbless trebles on the same plugs, and just flip-flopping different plugs with different hooks and stuff and seeing how it works. Because the more you do it, the more you learn, and also the healthier it is for the bass. Because if you think about it, the more entrance points the bass has in its mouth, the worse it's gonna be for them. And I've heard about having treble and then a single tail, which is actually a good idea, and I think I might do that for this plug, just to test it out. Just put a single tail on it. Although this is a smaller tail hook, this is a little small. I think I'm just gonna pinch the barbs on this, so we'll just start with that, seeing how that works. But you can do different different stuff, like putting single tails and stuff on the plugs as well, because the less barbs, and I prefer having single tail hooks on my plugs. As a lot of my plugs, I'll personally be switching the treble tail hooks out for singles, because I think that it rarely gets hooked eats the plug with the single tail, and most of the time it eats it with the double. Most of the time I'll eat it with the treble hook right from the base there, or from the stomach. That's where you get most of your hits. Although there is the odd bass that will eat it this way. So, yeah. Okay. Bam. 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 Okay. So, get that done too. Perfect. Okay. So, now I'm actually going to switch over to some smaller plugs here, that are not Puma plugs. Probably going to be throwing or grabbing I have so many, it's extraordinary how many plugs I have in here. The thing is, when you're fishing, you can never have too many plugs, but you can definitely tell that I haven't touched a lot of stuff since the beginning of the year. I have so many, I have so much stuff. Oh, I also just got my Van Staal serviced, my Van Staal 200, so I can add that to the rod. Putting this on my Century Stealth rod right now. This is gonna be a great, an absolutely fantastic rod for the spring, because in my opinion, it's a lighter rod. It's a very whippy rod, and it has, but at the same time, it's longer. It's 10'6", so I can cast it a lot further. So that's why I'm going to be using that a lot in the spring. I'm also going to use that when I go to Sandy Hook, New Jersey in the spring. Here you go. I'm going to lift this thing up so you guys can see all these plugs that I have in here. It's extraordinary. I have lots of stuff that I throw in the spring. I have darters and little, here's something that's an interesting one that I throw in the spring. It's not really that interesting, but a little peanut bunker, Sabile magic swimmer thing, or a shed swim. I don't even know what it's called. And then what else? I'm looking for these small SP minnows. I have a few small SP minnows that I want to switch for singles. Okay, here. Here we go. Bingo. This right here. I don't know if I have any other small SP minnows. Oh yes. No. No. I think you could probably tell what my favorite color SP minnow is. Just a little yellow action going. I think there's another one in there somewhere. But small yellow SP minnow. This, actually, the lip on this has been destroyed, but I'm banging it off the rocks. Talk about really what I need to do here is start taking the hooks off of a lot of these plugs, and then storing these in. So this is really what I'm going to be doing right now. Let's just start taking these hooks off the plugs. So I have a yellow darter here, which I haven't thrown since the spring, but that's okay. And this is like an 8x strong hook because I lost a fish. I actually didn't lose the fish, but I had a fish completely bend the treble hook of a super strike darter out. So at that point, I call it and I say that it's time. It is time to upgrade. And then I upgraded the hooks and the action is not as good. So these are the problems that we struggle with. Now, with Pumbaa plugs, we're gonna have a choice at some point that's gonna come out of having, however, like pretty much as heavy as you want treble hooks on your plugs. You just gotta add what treble hooks you want to purchase, and you can have a plug that has extra, like 8x strong or more treble hooks. So that's really cool. So right now and the other thing is when you have a bunch of extra treble hooks around, then you can see what plugs you're going to be using the most, and then you can have those going for you. So here's just like, I think I got this at a fishing show, custom needlefish, looked really good. Didn't fish it that much, but I should have fished it more. So if I know I'm not going to be using certain plugs a lot, then I will be taking the trebles off of them, and I'll be repurposing them later in the year. So this is a thing that I like to do, because then you can put your plugs, all your plugs without your trebles, in a bag and not really have to worry about hooks going everywhere, and then you can label them. And then what you can also do is put a little container with the right size trebles and the right size split rings for your plug in the bag with the things with the plugs, and you can then put on the trebles to the plugs that you need when you want them. So that's what I'm going to be doing right now. I'm just going to be taking out a lot of plugs, and I'll be telling stories. So SP minnows, the thing that comes to mind with me is I was fishing this one. I don't know why this always comes to mind, but I was fishing this one spot, and I wasn't having a lot of luck. This was a few years ago, and I was up pretty high, and I saw this bass that was probably 40 inches, and it was just cruising, maybe 10 feet below the surface, and the water was super clear. And I threw the SP minnow at it, and all of a sudden it just takes off at this SP minnow, and I was like, yes, I'm gonna hook this fish. And the fish comes right up to it, and then it stops right before it, and it just stays there and starts just floating there, and then it slowly starts sinking. And I'm like, no. And it started sinking below the plug, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the thing comes up, flies up at it, and hits it from beneath, and I hook set it, hooked into it, and then it shook once and spit the hook. It was a heartbreaker right there. But it was interesting how the bass swam up below it, or swam up to it, like it was interested, stopped, the plug was getting away from it, it sunk down below the water, and then it did another attack from below. I'm curious if you've ever seen a bass do that before, because I haven't seen one do it since, or at that time before then. I've never seen a bass do anything like that. That was really strange. I thought it was a strange reaction to the plug. Yeah. Oh, here's a tsunami talking popper. So I used a lot of these earlier in the year, and I did pretty well. I mean, you can see it's been beaten up. I've caught a lot of this plug has definitely seen some fish, but I hooked one really nice fish on a yellow tsunami talking popper, and I lost it into the rocks because my mono, I had 50-pound monofilament, and it snapped right in the middle. And I never had my 50-pound mono just snap right in the middle for no reason before, until that point. And then I've not fished mono, and I've also not fished 50-pound line since then, at least mono or fluorocarbon, because now I fish, at lowest I'll fish 60-pound fluorocarbon. It's a lie. I guess I'd fish 50-pound fluorocarbon is the lowest I'd go when I'm fishing off of sandy beach. But I guess in the spring, I'll go a little bit lower, but I don't like going below 50, because really I tend to catch a lot of my larger fish on on heavy on very I don't want to end up hooking into a really large fish with super light line, because that's how you lose really big fish, is when you're underprepared. And I never want to be underprepared for a big fish. I'm always prepared to hook into a giant fish when I'm fishing. I'm always prepared to hook into like a 30-40 pound bass. I never want to be caught off guard and lose a fish of a lifetime. You know, if I hook a bass that's in the 50 pound, that's like a 50 pounder or bigger, I never want to be caught off guard by that. My first keeper of the season was caught on the black and purple darter, by the way. So that's a cool thing. My first keeper of the season was 33 inches. Yeah, so that was cool. I pardoned the first keeper of the season. Not that I really keep very many fish, but yeah, I always let go the first keeper of the season. The only time that I really keep fish is if they're injured. So if I either gut hook a fish, or it gets hooked in the gill, or it's bleeding out for some reason, or in the eyes, and it's a keeper, then I tend to keep it. That would be the only time I'd end up keeping a fish. Let me know what your thoughts on keeping a fish if it's been hooked bad is. What would you do if you hooked a really large fish? You got hooked a really large fish. Would you keep it, or would you release it, or try to release it? And I know a lot of the time, when you got hook a fish, you should just cut the line if it's not bleeding or anything. But what if the bass was bleeding badly? That's the question. You know, you hook a 30-pound bass, but it's got hooked and bleeding badly. What do? Do you keep it, or do you release it? You know, I'm big on the conservation, but you know, at that point, is it ethical to keep the bass? I'm dehooking a Sabile stick shad, and I actually caught my biggest bass ever on this plug right here. So that's a interesting story. I was fishing at the canal, and you can actually see it in the documentary Coastline, where I was spending a long time fishing for trying to catch a really large striped bass for this documentary, and I wasn't having a lot of luck, and I was kind of facing the fact that the population of striped bass is pretty thin, you know, at that time, and it's difficult to catch a big fish unless you know how to catch big fish in this day and age. And I was not being very smart during that documentary. However, I had the knowledge to do what I was doing this year. And as soon as I started actually just utilizing, or just doing my homework, really, as soon as I started doing my homework, I started catching big fish. It's as simple as that. You do your homework with the moon phase, the tide, and the wind, you're going to catch a big fish. It's just how it works. You know, if you're not paying attention to that, then you're not going to catch a big fish. Or if you do, you're going to be extremely lucky to catch one. So always pay attention to the moon and the tide and everything like that, because you'll be extremely lucky to catch a big fish if otherwise. So this hook, at what point do hooks get too rusty? I say this is the point. You know, I mean, the hooks on this are also dull, like extremely dull. So what I do at this point, I'm just gonna take the split ring off because the split ring's still good, and I'm gonna chuck this hook. So I think that when the whole hook is covered in like a crust of rust, then it's time to get rid of your hook. Yeah, that's definitely done. But the split ring's still good, so we'll save that. I have a lot of plugs in here that just have a lot of plugs in here. So, yeah. This is gonna be a long process to do. You know, I have so many weird and interesting stories about a lot of these plugs, and I wonder, like, because when I'm doing this, I just think of it's really cool. So when I'm dehooking my plugs, each plug I feel like I have that I've fished with, I have a weird memory of when I was fishing it and what happened. I have memories of this one breaking one of my rods because I casted it on too light of a rod, even though it was actually rated for it, but still exploded. And that's the thing, like, I have like an okay cast. Like, I put a lot of pressure on my rods when I cast. I try to just backload it and then I launch it. And I feel like I've never been fit. Like, there's only one time that I've ever not really been able to get out to where the fish were. And that was frustrating. I was fishing off of a beach, and it was in a nor'easter in the fall, and was it a nor'easter? It was, yeah, pretty much. And it was blowing extremely, extremely hard, and there was some decent sized waves, and hundreds and thousands of birds in the air. And I saw it as I was driving by. I was like, okay, it's time. Their bass are definitely blitzing right now. I need to go and try to get some of these fish. And so what I did is I waited out I tried to cast for the bass because they're blitzing really hard, and I couldn't get them because they're too far out. They're probably 200 yards off the beach, and I can cast maybe 150 yards with a heavy pencil and a really good rod and 30-pound test line. And that's like tough to do. But there's a few fish that were and especially in the wind, that's extremely tough to do. But there's a few fish that when the wind was blowing right, I could cast out, and I got it probably 100 yards out, and I was still, they were 200 yards out easy, and I still was a little bit short. So, and I was using a Tsunami Talking Popper XD, and I was trying to get it out there. Actually, I have the exact pencil that I was using in here. I can show you it. And I was trying to get out to these blitzing bass, and I was waiting out, and I was getting pushed back by the waves, and I was waiting out and getting pushed back by the waves, and there was a pretty decent rip current coming through it as well. Like, there's definitely a decent rip current, and I was trying my best to get out towards where these fish were, and I was having a very difficult time. And I finally got one cast into the strike zone. I was up to my neck in the water, and all of a sudden I was bent on a nice, like, 25-incher. And it was fine, but the annoying part was I was watching 40-inch bass blitzing on what I thought was adult menhaden at that time, or at least larger peanut bunker. And so, yeah, I mean, it was it was a little bit frustrating because I couldn't quite get out to where they're casting at, and I was getting absolutely pounded and absolutely soaked. But I was able to get it out far enough with my cast that I could get into a few fish. But then they moved further and further offshore to the point that I couldn't get it anywhere close to where they were. I tried extremely hard to get my plug out to where they were, but I was having an extremely hard time doing it. One of my favorite plugs, and there's a story that goes along with it, is the first topwater plug I ever used. Now, the first topwater plug I ever used is the Smack It Junior. I don't know if, and this is a Smack It Senior, or like, hooking myself here, but this is a Smack It. Smack Its are extremely good spring poppers. They're extremely good poppers. I love them. You know, I can't say anything really bad. They come with decent hardware, and they just sound really, really good in the water. And I was going to a tackle store that's no longer here, but and the guy was like telling a story about the Smack It Junior, how he was fishing with an 11-pound test for schoolies in the estuary, and then he had a 42-inch bass come up and eat it, and he fought it for like 35 minutes, and finally got it in, and landed it on his super light rod. So that was a pretty interesting story, I thought, and pretty cool one. But it was the first topwater plug I ever used. So when I was first introduced to that plug, I didn't like it because I just couldn't catch. I didn't really know how to work it, and I was having such a hard time getting it in front of bass, and I was not very confident with the plug, and confidence is super key. And I'm actually going to do another podcast on how to not use superstition and confidence to rule how you fish, because that's important, and that's going to be probably my next podcast that I do, because superstition and confidence is a killer of fishing. But I wasn't very confident with that plug, so I didn't really throw it that often, or that much at all, and I was having a hard time just working it, like not knowing how to work it. So then I finally figured out how to work it, and I was sitting on this bank. It wasn't a bank. It was like I was sitting on the side of a cliff, and right along the side of the cliff there was bass, just probably 30 schoolie bass, just hugging the bank of this cliff. And I was throwing it up the cliff, and I was working it back, and the bass were exploding on it and jumping out of the water, and I was so stunned at how awesome it is to throw topwater plugs. And I was super hooked at fishing topwater plugs after that. And I get the biggest kick out of throwing the smallest plugs and catching the smallest bass. Like, I'll throw the smallest, like, jumping minnows, and I'll be so stoked to hook into a small fish. I have no qualms about hooking into, like, fishing for tiny bass on topwater with small gear. I'll go to the harbor and I'll throw a little Smack It around, and I'll have the best time catching bass. And I just get such a kick out of throwing those plugs, or throwing little plugs for bass on top. And I caught some big bass on some small topwater plugs. So that's the other thing. Like, when you're fishing, I would never. I think that you can get too big at points, but it's pretty difficult to get too big for a striped bass. Too big is kind of unheard of, in my opinion. You can get. I've thrown some extraordinarily large plugs and gotten them eaten by some nice sized fish. And that's the thing, when you throw a big plug, you can weed out a lot of smaller bass, but at the same time, you'll catch a lot of small bass on a lot of really large plugs. And you'll be shocked by how many large fish you can end up catching on a small plug. I mean, it's pretty crazy. Yeah, I mean it's pretty crazy to see how many how small of a bass will eat such a big plug. I've thrown a pencil that had to have been like a close to 15-inch pencil popper. It was huge plug, and I caught a bass that was probably 10 and maybe a little more than 10. It was probably 13 inches on it. I caught a 13-inch bass on the plug. I mean, absolutely tiny, but it still had it still wanted to go after something that it couldn't possibly fit in its mouth, but it did it anyway. Like, that just shows you how crazy and awesome striped bass actually are, that they'll go after such large plugs even though they're so small. They're so predatory and so aggressive that they're not fazed by a large plug. They'll still go after, or a large piece of bait. They'll still attack it with the same ferocity that they'll go after a big plug with. Yeah, I'm just trying to unhook this, man. It's tough right here for some reason. There you go. Yeah, just unhooking lots of plugs. I've only done like 11 plugs. And trust me, we have more than 11 plugs to go. I probably won't let you guys be tortured by me on doing all these plugs, but you know, it's kind of cool because it helps me remember certain things when I'm doing these plugs, about times, certain cool stories that otherwise wouldn't remember if I was just trying to remember them and write them down. Because there's certain things that I've caught that have just been extraordinary. With the amount of time that I've spent on the water fishing, crazy things happen. Yeah, I mean, I one time was like, how I found this plug. I was walking across the rocks, and I look in the water, and there's a crab with some braided line around its leg. And I pick up the crab, and I pull in probably 15 yards of line to this plug right here. And then I put new hooks on it, but it was funny because it was attached to the crab, and then I untangled the crab from the line, and it was dragging this giant plug behind it. Imagine if it was in some current or something, and a striped bass actually ate the plug. That'd be pretty crazy. But yeah, kind of interesting. Yeah, so I guess this is probably a good, time to end it. I mean, it was kind of a different podcast to just kind of setting up and getting ready for spring, but I thought it would be kind of cool for you guys to tune in and listen to me just going off about weird stories, just fun fishing stories or experiences that I've had, because it's been a pretty interesting last few years of fishing for me, and it's pretty cool that, how it's evolved and what I've been fishing now, and looking back and reminiscing this time of year. I'm really starting to get the feels, like really starting to want to be catching fish again. I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure there's lots of people that are very excited for the season to begin. And yeah, so I hope you guys like this podcast. And again, if you have any questions, DM me on Instagram at Striped Bass Hunt, or on YouTube, Striped Bass Hunt on YouTube. Yeah, please come and subscribe. The fishing show will be on there soon. As soon as in probably a few months from now, but still. There'll be other content on there as well. And leave questions and comments on that as well. Okay, so thank you guys for listening and watching, and I'll see you next time.